Welcome to HFY Review, where the galaxy learns a lesson it keeps forgetting. Out there, empires rise on fear, councils preach order, and alien warlords swear humans are fragile, soft, predictable. They look at Earth and see a quiet world, a small world, a world that should kneel. But they never ask the right question. Not are humans strong, not are humans advanced. The only question that matters is, what happens when you push them too far? Because humans don't always roar. Sometimes they go silent. They remember, they build, they wait. And then, one day, a signal hits the stars. A fleet appears where no fleet should exist, and an entire civilization realizes the nightmare wasn't the monster under the bed. It was the one holding the bed frame. This is HFY Review, the most cinematic, brutal, and heart-pounding human-first sci-fi stories on YouTube. Now buckle in. The galaxy's about to meet us.
Harlan Vex had built his cabin to be ignored. The shingles were reclaimed hull plates, painted the brown of wet bark, the chimney vented steam that smelled like cedar, and the doorbell was a length of copper wire tied to a cowbell because the last thing he wanted out here on Icarus Delta's North Ridge was a networked anything. The world could keep its feeds and its sirens. He had old engines to rebuild and a creek to argue with. Dusk slid down the slope and pooled beneath the pines, and the kind of quiet he prized, thick, honest, full of useful small sounds, settled around the porch. He was half under the generator, coaxing a stubborn timing ring with a whispered threat when someone knocked on the air. It wasn't a sound. It was a pressure change that tapped the cabin twice, soft and exact, the way a careful knuckle meets a door. The cowbell didn't move. The wren on the gutter went from song to statue. Harlan banged his head on the generator pan, said a word that didn't improve the situation, and slid out on his back, spanner still in his fist. The second tap came with a breath of heat that didn't belong to the evening. His wind chime, made of misdrilled bolts and a bent piston ring, answered in 3 terrified notes. Harlan pushed himself up and stood, exactly as fast as a man stands when he hasn't been surprised in a decade and doesn't enjoy the reminder. From the tree line, eyes opened. 6 at first. No, 8. No, he'd miscounted because some were double-lidded and some glowed and some reflected only the shape of the porch lamp. The trunks parted the way curtains do when someone important has decided to make the effort. What stepped out would have made a city run and a fleet argue with its paperwork. Dragons, though a biologist, would have written a kinder word. Long, low, ridge-backed, silver as river rock where the light caught scale and the size of freight crawlers. They did not loom. They halted with the courtesy of creatures who could break a house by sneezing and were determined not to. Harlan's throat forgot the choreography of swallowing. He'd seen one once at a distance, a black silhouette skimming a battlefield smear years ago, a rumor with wings. This was a herd. He hated the word for them even as his mind grabbed it. It sounded like cattle, and nothing that looked like that had ever agreed to be counted. The one at the fore stepped forward, and even with the years he'd put between himself and war, he recognized rank. She carried authority in how she put weight on the ground. Spines along her shoulders sat at parade rest. Scars made pale seams like punctuation where history had leaned too hard. She did not show teeth. She lowered her head until her eyes were level with his roofline and blinked. Slow, a gesture that in some species is trust and in others means you are about to die with dignity. Harlan's spanner suddenly felt impolite. "Evening," he said, because someone had to say something, and hell if it was going to be a scream. The lead dragon exhaled. Not smoke, a warmth that lifted the fog above the creek and rolled it away like a tablecloth. Behind her, the shapes shifted so he could see the rest. 2 juveniles limped between the legs of a broad-shouldered male whose wings dragged wrong, one joint folded where it ought to unfold. A small one, hatchling, kept trying to stand taller than it was, as if presence could stiffen a flawless line out of a wobbly body. Another adult held one foreleg off the ground, talons curled, the wrist joint swollen like a bad weld. They didn't speak, they asked. Harlan felt that ask land in his ribs. He put the spanner down on the railing, slowly, as if the porch had developed opinions. "Right," he said to no one in particular, to the mountain, to his better judgment which had stepped out for a smoke. "Who told you I was any good?" The smallest one took 2 steps forward, tripped on a root, and collected itself with the outrage particular to small things whose dignity is draft legal. It lifted its muzzle toward his porch light and made a sound like a kettle, remembering it is meant to sing. The lead female answered with a low chord that ran along the boards beneath Harlan's boots and sorted his bones from tallest to smallest. He'd done triage on war machines under worse light. He'd bailed a lung out of an engine with fishing line and faith. He was alone on a ridge with a herd of history and a tool chest older than most treaties. Somewhere at the bottom of all the calculations was a fact that refused to be negotiated. They had knocked. He held up both hands, palms out, and tried to look like a refuge. Okay. Let me get a lamp. The dragons watched him move with the stillness of hunters, resisting the impulse to become their silhouettes. He went inside, grabbed the flood lamp, the first aid crate, the medjol, the roll of fusion patch mesh he kept for hull plates that didn't feel like staying attached, and the good blanket from the arm of the chair, because the night had teeth. When he stepped back onto the porch, the lead dragon dipped her head once, as if acknowledging a new understanding. This is the human. This is the one with the light. Harlan didn't know it yet, but the pines around the cabin had filled with eyes by then, and not all of them belonged to dragons. He set the lamp on the top step and swept its circle over the nearest injuries, the way he would over a damaged intake. Not hunting gore, but entry points for repair. The male with the ruined wing accepted the light without flinch, the membrane catching it opaline and bloodless. The joint itself looked wrong in a way that made Harlan's fingers itch. It wasn't just torn. The bones, if they were bones, had heated and sagged like a heat sink run out of patience. The smell that came off the wound reminded him of long-ago hangars at dawn. Hot metal, mineral sweat, the faint sweetness of stress baked out of composite. "You're built like an engine," he murmured, half to the wing, half to himself. The male blinked at him with an eye the color of old honey and didn't disagree. Harlan took 3 steps toward the lead female and stopped because she had not moved. She watched the way his boot lifted and fell, the set of his shoulders, the angle of the light, and when he put the crate down, she put her chin on the snow at his feet. The gesture forced humility out of him, like a confession. Up close, she wasn't just silver. She was a map. Each scale carried a bruise of color where years had touched it, a delta of blue where a tendon had once strained, a fog of green where cool had settled after a run, tiny crescents of pallor where gravel had won small arguments with skin. Harlan let his hands do what they remembered. He cut the mesh into a trapezoid with his pocket shears and tested its give. He didn't know draconic anatomy, but he knew heat stress and leverage. "This will stiffen what's soft," he told the wing, as if the wing had been waiting to be included in the plan. He warmed the fusion patch with a breath and the portable torch until it went from rigid to obedient, and he laid it along the injured span, following the line of a tendon the thickness of his wrist. The mesh tongue cooled. The smell of new polymer sighed into the cold. The dragon held still the way soldiers hold still when a medic with a needle is more frightening than a bullet. When Harlan pressed the patch at the edge to seal, the male's tail snapped reflexively and gouged a trench in the snow. Harlan flinched and then laughed at himself, a short bark that dared the night to think he was afraid. "Yeah," he said more gently. "Hate that part too." He moved to the female with the bad wrist. The joint had swollen in 3 wrong places and refused to settle. He palpated along the line with the back of his knuckles, a trick he'd learned on crankshafts, feeling for heat with skin not yet committed to work. She hissed, a sound so contained it made him feel like he'd been trusted with a secret. He rolled the joint once, twice, and felt the catch where cartilage had folded, where whatever dragons had instead of cartilage had decided it was tired of doing the right thing. "I can't fix the inside tonight," he told her, "but I can brace you until daylight." He cut 2 lengths of composite strut from a stack he kept for propping fences and miracles, patted them with the good blanket he'd sworn 5 minutes ago he wasn't going to ruin, and bandaged them in place with a spool of self-fusing tape. When he finished, the joint sat at a gentler angle, sulking but sensible. The dragon tested it, put weight down, grimaced in a very draconic way that involved too many teeth, and then set her head against his shoulder with the absolute pressure of a creature who has never needed to be careful and is learning fast. "Hey," he said, voice low because voices go low when you're under a cathedral. "Hey, now, we're getting there." The juveniles were easier. One had a slice along the side of the throat that looked worse than it was, all appetite and drama. He cleaned it with warmed water, muttered apologies as he teased out a splinter of someone else's ship, painted imperial blue, and sealed the edge with medjol. The other had bent a wingtip into a shape wings don't prefer. It popped back into place with a wet hiccup that made Harlan and the juvenile both wince and then grin, respectively. The small one, he refused to call it a runt with the mother watching him the way jury benches watch men, was trouble in a coil. He could feel it vibrating with held energy. It sniffed his glove, his knee, the corner of his toolbox, the spanner, and then tried to taste the arc welder. Harlan reached around blindly, soft-palmed its muzzle away from electrocution without looking, the way mechanics move in shops full of apprentices and toddlers, and the little beast pouted exactly like both. "Don't," he said, and for some reason this pleased the mother. A low rumble ran through the herd, a chord that started in ribs and ended at the ridge spines and made the porch boards hum. It wasn't threat, it was agreement. He worked until his breath showed white in ragged edits and the lamp crusted with frost. The dragon's own light, biolum across the underscales, faint engine glow where vascular and machine met in the old war way, kept the air an inch above snow warm as a top blanket. Once, he paused to peel a protein bar out of his pocket, and the small one tried to steal it with such earnest malice he almost let it, then compromised by breaking it in half. He ate his share in 3 bites and gave them the rest. The hatchling took the last piece between teeth, and after exactly 1 chew, dropped it on his boot like a tip. "Much obliged," Harlan told it gravely. "We take cash and medals too," he expected, at some point in this strange clinic under the pines, for fear to arrive late and officious. It didn't. Worry came, certainly, that he'd brace a joint wrong, that some old ordinance would blink awake and decide he was a collaborator, that his credit with the local supply depot would not cover the amount of medjol he was pouring onto history. But fear stayed away, perhaps because there wasn't room. The night had been filled by work, and the work had been a bridge, and on bridges you keep walking. He was taping the last wrap on the lead female's wrist when she moved for the first time without signaling it. Her head came up and turned toward the south, sudden and absolute as a compass point. Every neck in the herd followed. The pines went silent again, the wrong kind of silent, the kind that rides in on something else's lungs. Harlan's skin tried to lift off his bones. "What is it?" he asked, because habit. The mother lowered her head until her eye was level with the porch lamp, and Harlan, careful not to read himself into it, recognized a very old question in a very old pupil. "Are you ready?" Lights pulsed between the trees. Not fireflies, not animals. The steady, unromantic blink of survey drones, tiered in a grid, sweeping with a net that didn't care if it caught fish or stars. The nearest one crested the low stone wall. Harlan had stacked himself and took his cabin's measure with a rude, bright ping. His porch light blinked back in accidental answer. The drone's sensor slit rotated toward the silver line of dragons, and paused as if surprised by its own luck. Harlan didn't move. He didn't have to. The lead dragon stepped forward so her shoulder filled his whole world, and, without drama, curved her body around the cabin until her flank met the far gutter. Metal creaked under the new windbreak. Heat flowed off her in slow waves. The hatchling's small head tucked under the porch rail as if it had built the place and only now remembered the blueprints. The drone's ping grew eager. Harlan straightened and discovered that his voice, when it returned, had borrowed iron from somewhere. "Inside," he told nobody human, and the part of him that plans ahead wondered what he thought he meant, because there was nothing inside except a bed he barely used, and a kitchen that could feed exactly 1 man and an unreasonably well-stocked tool wall. He went anyway, shoulders tight, to do something stupid. On the table under the window lay a battered transceiver he kept for weather and regrets. He tuned the ridge frequency, the one his neighbors used to warn each other about fallen trees and tourists with expensive shoes. "Agnes," he said, hoping the old woman's insomnia loved him tonight. "If you're awake, you didn't hear this from me, but you might want to turn your porch camera off and your porch light on." Static gnawed the edge of the channel. Then Agnes's voice, dry as scrub and twice as tough, said, "I don't own a camera. I own a broom. Are the ghosts friendly?" "Large. Hungry for parts. Will pay in stories." "Good. I'm making tea." When he turned back, the drone had come closer. Its light strobed the ridge in clinical slices. The mother dragon looked over her shoulder at him, a small question riding the bigger one. "Still with us?" Harlan picked up his spanner because some habits organize the heart and stepped into the lamped circle to stand where anyone looking down a scope would see him first. "You knocked," he said under his breath, to the herd, to the night, to whatever had just gone sniffing after this moment with jurisdiction in its mouth. "So I answer." He did not imagine in that second the patrols that would come, or the songs that would break them, or the letters his porch would wear like medals. He did not imagine anything beyond the next thing, which was this. A man on a porch, a herd of dragons breathing behind a wall of his making, a sky thinking hard about what kind of story it wanted to be. The first drone made the mistake of acting like it was alone. It skimmed the stone wall, licked the porch with LiDAR, and blinked an impatient request for identification. Harlan showed it the boring face of legal text. His emergency transponder blinked the salvage and sanctuary clause Earth had negotiated back when the outer colonies still pretended to read each other's treaties. The drone considered, made a bureaucrat's noise, and widened its scan. What he didn't say into the open channel was that the clause held as well as a paper umbrella in a grease fire when the target was classified bioordnance. More light slid between the trees, neat and hungry. Above the pines, something bigger drifted. A carrier keeping perfect distance, letting its machines do the touching so its conscience stayed clean. The herd heard the altitude before Harlan did and pressed closer, scales rasping softly against the cabin siding. Heat rolled over the porch in waves that smelled faintly of rain on iron. "Agnes," he said into the transceiver, "if that tea is on, flip every light you own. Tell Fry to do the same. If the ridge looks like a festival, their thermal map goes blind. You'll get a visit from the grid inspector." Agnes replied dryly, "I will bake him a pie." Porch lights winked awake along the north slope like a constellation remembering itself. Harlan tucked the transceiver into his pocket, crossed to the generator, and yanked open the front panel. He had built the thing to be stubborn in winter and grudging in spring. Tonight, it would be a liar. He poured a breath into the idle, tuned the governor's screw until the hum crawled up his spine and sat behind his eyes, and clipped a cable to the old lightning rod bolted to the chimney. The copper sang. The mist-drilled bolt chimes hanging along the eaves twitched like dogs that had just remembered thunder. The lead dragon watched him with a look he recognized from hangar floors at O300, predators learning the alphabet of a different trade. He pointed at the snow with his boot and mimed rubbing it into his palms. She got it before he finished the gesture. The herd lay down in the drift as one body, rolled shoulders, buried bellies, coated their underscales in cold the way soldiers coat hardware with mud. The hatchling clearly thought this was a game invented for its benefit and threw itself into the nearest drift with such abandon the porch shook. Harlan reached down without looking and steered a little muzzle away from the generator belts. The first net dropped with a petulant grace. It didn't whistle or boom. It arrived like a decision, a dark rectangle that opened above the injured male's back and fell with a stifled crackle. Microcapacitors glittered along the filaments, promising compliance to anything wrapped in them. Harlan swore, a word so old it made the bolts remember basements, and moved. He threw his blanket over the hub at the net's center, dielectric first, instinct second, and jammed the spanner into the quick release with both hands. The device bit him through wool and callus, but his body had already paid for 100 burns. It knew where to put pain. The net twitched, tried to tighten, and met the blanket's stubborn refusal to conduct. Harlan found the pin, wrenched until his shoulder made a noise he refused to catalog, and the hub came free in his hands with a jolt that turned his teeth into tuning forks. The second net didn't aim at him. It fell at the hatchling with the cruel accuracy of something proud of its targeting software. The mother moved so fast he saw the air behind her body trying to catch up. She took the edge across her flank and pinned the filaments with her own weight, letting the charge climb into metal where it could spend itself on scale instead of nerve. The smell of cooked ozone and old battery rose like a ghost. Harlan flung the first hub toward the creek. The generator's tuned hum ate the spill of charge before it could bite a tree, and dove under the mother's shoulder, cutting blindly, talking because talking makes hands steady. I know, he said, the way men talk to bolts and calves and newly born machines. It hates you. We hate it back. Hold. Just a second. The juvenile with the throat cut made a sound that wasn't fear. It was rage, throttled to fit inside a small body. The male with the repaired wing planted his unbraced side and hauled, lifting the net off the hatchling long enough for Harlan to slice a path. The little one wriggled out, scrambled, and threw itself under the porch as if it had invented the idea of safety. The mother exhaled a blast of heat that turned the net's filaments into luminous threads, shook herself once, and half the device fell to ash. The other half clung and sizzled. Harlan shoved the torch into the seam and burned the last of it away, blinking sparks out of his eyelashes. Above them, the carrier changed its mind and descended a meter. That was all. The kind of movement accountants make when they say yes. 4 more drones slid from its belly in a square, nets unfurling like smug opinions, signals tight-beamed to ignore the legal soup he was spilling into the general band. The generator's hum climbed a step, then another, until the bolt chimes on the eaves wove a thin, bright lattice in the air. Louder, Harlan told the cabin, and the cabin obliged. He couldn't block the nets forever. He needed the machines to doubt themselves. He scanned the herd, eyes, throats, chests, remembered the cord that had run through his boots when the mother had spoken to the ground, and made a bet electricians would call insane and singers would call obvious. "Can you give me that note again?" he asked the lead, tapping his chest where he had felt it. He hummed it, low and ridiculous, a human trying to speak cathedral. The dragon tilted her head, tested air, and released a tone that made his lamp bow respectfully in its own light. The others answered a breath later, each a fraction sharp or flat because families never line up perfect. The sound crawled up the lightning rod and turned around, inspecting his generator with the curiosity of weather. Harlan tuned the idol until the hum kissed the dragon's note and held. The chimes took a harmony. The copper cable lifted gooseflesh along his arms. The drones drifted into the field, nets open, and met a sky that already belonged to a different psalm. Their cheap gyros did what gyros do when fed a frequency they were not designed to admit. They precessed, slow, then quick, then silly. 2 tilted 20 degrees and tried to perform a calculation that ended in a shrug. A third forgot what down meant and bumped a pine with the tentative affection of a drunk man greeting a lamppost. The fourth backed away like a cat discovering a cucumber. "Stay with me," Harlan muttered, not sure whether he meant the generator or the herd or his own scrappy courage. He adjusted the governor another hair. The chimes sang sharp, then true. Agnes's lights along the ridge flashed in a sloppy rhythm, as neighbors who had nowhere better to be joined a fight they didn't understand with the only tools they had. Somewhere down valley a quad bike revved, thought better of being a hero, and turned its engine into a consenting part of the noise. One net still fell, a stubborn rectangle that didn't care about music. Harlan stepped to meet it with the blanket and found his path blocked by the juvenile who had been all appetite and drama 10 minutes ago. It planted its feet, raised its ridiculous chest, and spat a line of flame thinner than a whip. The filament glowed, broke, and the net collapsed into a hopeless tangle that wrapped itself around a birch and repented. For a moment that stretched and then held. The woods remembered how to be woods. The herd kept the note. The cabin hummed like a contented engine. The carrier above reconsidered the economics of public relations. The drones quivered in their square, indecisive, then rose 5 meters in embarrassed retreat. Harlan let the governor ease a hair, and the hum settled around the porch like a blanket. He leaned his forehead against the generator housing and laughed once, because laughter is how you close a circuit without smoke. When he turned, The mother had lowered herself until her eye was level with his chest again. Up close, he could see the hairlines scorch where the net had kissed her, a pale crescent that would darken by morning. She inhaled the shape of him, the metal on his hands, the tin of fear he had put on a shelf and forgotten, and her exhale warmed his jacket without setting it on fire. "We'll need better than this next time," he told her. "But for now—" The porch light blinked. His transceiver squawked as if offended at being left out of the story. A voice that grew up in officer school and never forgave it announced, very carefully, "Unregistered sanctuary on grid 12. This is Patrol Picket 7. Disengage anomalous emissions and stand by for inspection." Harlan wiped a smear of ash off his cheek and lifted the handset. "This is Harlan Vex, registered Earth citizen, licensed mechanic, and owner of the ugliest couch in 3 counties. You've dropped traps on injured wildlife under my roof. You can come down here and explain that to my neighbors in a language that makes sense to their kids, or you can stay up there and explain it to your conscience. Your call." There was a silence long enough to suggest the pilot had turned off her mic to have an argument with someone whose pay grade had a balcony. The carrier drifted sideways, ridiculous with indecision, then rose into cloud like a lyre. The lights in the woods stayed on. The ridge kept its hum because it liked the way the sound held the night together. The dragons turned their heads, as one toward the south again, and Harlan understood, at last, the part of the ask he hadn't heard when they'd knocked. This wasn't just about nets. Something else waited between the trees that the herd couldn't fix alone. "All right," he said, voice smaller than the moment and exactly the right size. "Show me." They moved like a river, deciding to change course. The lead female flowed into the trees, weight measured, head low. The injured male kept pace with the care of a professional, pretending a limp wasn't a limp. Harlan trotted at the shoulder of the mother because she made a windbreak, and because standing inside her radius of warmth had already become a habit he would not want to break. The hatchling stuck so close to his knee that he nearly trod its forefoot twice, and apologized both times, like a man excusing himself at a crowded bar. The pines thinned where an old logging road had once insisted the mountain was negotiable. A half-collapsed culvert yawned like a bad idea. Beyond it, the ground fell away into a bowl where the snow had crusted into a white sheet too smooth for weather. Harlan's breath logged the wrong temperature. The dragons' breath steamed and then did not. The basin wasn't a meadow. It was a roof. The lead female stepped to the lip and tapped the crust once with a claw. A dull note came back, unhelpful and too even. She tapped again, a fraction to the left, then slashed a line and listened to the way the sound ran under the skin of snow. Harlan knelt and pressed his ear to the crust. Cold bit through denim and argued his priorities. Beneath the ice, the mountain sounded like a sleeping animal, with one kidney failing. He pulled his glove down with his teeth and scraped at the crust with his bare nails until a seam appeared. A thin crack that sucked in his exhale, the way thirsty metal drinks humidity. The scent that came up was not creek or loam. It was old air and a breath of something sweet and gone wrong. He set his palm flat. Warmth pooled under the heel of his hand where heat should not be. "Structure," he muttered, half remembering schematics he'd ogled in a war he never admitted to wanting. Something built into the hill, storage, or a den. He looked up at the mother. "Yours?" Her head dipped, a first admission. She pressed her brow to the crust, and the snow gave way under that crown like a subject kneeling. The hole she opened breathed out a smell that turned Harlan's bones into tuning forks. Bioplastic and machine oil, and the long, low note of a thing designed to last failing with dignity. They widened the hole with their different tools, talons like backhoes, a human's stubborn hands, a breath that melted edges without dropping a ceiling. The opening yawned enough to fit a dragon's shoulder, and then the world tilted. Heat rushed up with a shudder that made the younger dragons squeal and flattened Harlan's hair to his skull. He saw the edge of a curved wall under the ice, slick with condensation, and the old mark every battlefield mechanic learns, whether he wants it or not. A stencil in a language of symbols that meant, "Do not tell civilians this exists." He went in because some choices come pre-made. The passage felt like swallowing, the kind of throat that had been engineered to take machines in and out quietly. He slid on his spine and landed knee-deep in warm water that lapped metal like a pet tipping its bowl. A low glow pulsed along the rib of the structure. Alive but out of rhythm. The mother came behind him, slow, careful, making the tight space into a different shape by her presence alone. The injured male stayed above, a hinge between worlds, keeping the younger ones from inventing new ways to be endangered. The chamber lit itself the way old things do when they are grateful for attention. Harlan blinked away the change and saw what the herd had not said. A brood ship, long marooned and half swallowed by the mountain, had split its belly. Cradles lay in 2 neat rows along the curve, most dark, a few lit with a heartbeat gold, one blinking a frantic, silent plea. A tangle of roots had found a seam and prospered, drinking the ship's warmth and returning nothing but apology. Overhead, a line of mineral drips had corroded a joint until the seal failed. Water had pooled under the cradles and then risen, and then turned into the heavy warm soup his boots complained about. The ship's pumps muttered in a corner like old men. One cradle tilted where a support had bent. Inside it, something too new for this much trouble thumped its small body against the glass with the optimism that keeps species alive. Harlan was moving before his mind caught up. He waded to the cradle, hands flat on the casing as if greeting a large, rude dog. "Hey," he said, because the word is a bridge in any language. "Hold on." The mother tried to follow and checked herself mid-motion. Her body filled the entry like a cork. Her eye alone could see into the room. The sound she made, not a roar, a scrape, set dust whispering down ancient ribs. Harlan felt it in his teeth like a promise to gravity that would be kept later. He looked at the cradle's mount and saw the thing every mechanic both loves and fears. A system designed to be fixed by a person exactly like him under conditions exactly unlike these. The support had kinked an inch from the anchor. The emergency release had corroded in the open position. The cradle's own stabilizers, brave as fools, were trying to keep level, and had burned out one by one, loyal to extinction. "You were built by people who cared," he told it, and set his shoulder under the bent strut. It didn't budge. He pulled the spanner from his belt, wedged it between the cradle frame and the bent support, and leaned his whole life on it. It gave a millimeter. The hatchling inside, he refused to call it anything smaller, bobbled like a ship in a bathtub, and kept hurling its nose against the clear wall as if love could be measured in bruises. Behind him, the mother exhaled through her nostrils and the air pressed on his back with a heat that wasn't encouragement. It was prayer. He grunted, adjusted his stance, and found a third point of leverage with the heel of his hand and a curse that tasted like solder. The strut squealed and moved another grain. "Gonna need a psalm," he panted, words for his own nerves as much as hers. "Any kind will do. Loud helps." What came out of the dragon would have shattered glass, if glass were here to be dramatic. The broodship's ribs vibrated. The water he stood in wrinkled with pleasure. The lit cradles steadied their pulses as if buckling themselves. Somewhere outside the herd answered, and the hum from the ridge, the generator, Agnes's porch, the ridiculous chimes, found its way down into the bones of the ship, through Harlan's back and into his arms, until he was just another piece of tuned metal, doing the job he was built for. The strut snapped straight with a pang that ran up his arm and down his spine and out into the water with a hiss. The cradle righted. The little body inside flipped once, offended, and then settled, pressed against the glass where Harlan's hand had been, as if claiming him as part of the design. He laughed, then choked on the lump that laughter had knocked loose, and banged the emergency drain with the butt of his spanner until it remembered it had obligations. The water fell an inch. The pumps, humiliated into activity, found their old cadence. He followed the line of corrosion to the leaky joint, ripped off his coat, and jammed it into the gap with a sacrilege he'd apologize for to both coat and ship later. The flow slowed to a sulk. He taped it with the last of his self-fusing bandage in a spiral that would make a shipwright snort and a grandmother nod because it would hold. When he turned, the mother had her head in as far as physics allowed, her eye rimmed with heat that made it look molten. He reached up, as carefully as a man touches a live wire after fixing the fuse, and set his hand against the smooth bone above her nostril. "Got one," he said. "There might be more." Behind her, something crashed in the trees. the wrong rhythm of boots. Voices, amplified and empty of echo, called instructions to people who never had to worry about snow in their shoes. The carrier had found its courage in the space between events. The drones had remembered their job descriptions. The patrol had decided to be brave with other people's skin. Harlan's mouth went dry and then wet again, with a recklessness he had only ever spent on machines that asked too much. He keyed the transceiver on his shoulder, which had survived water and now owed him, and broadcast the most illegal sentence a civilian can say without immediately being struck by lightning. "This site is a medical rescue," he shouted, not because they were far, but because the mountain deserved to hear it. "You come into this basin with weapons, and you will take responsibility before the families who live here and the cameras they don't own. Stand down or stand in front of what you've made." Silence answered him, expensive and brief. Then a voice, younger than he wanted, shook itself into the channel. "Harlan Vex, you are interfering with sovereign security operations." "Kid," Agnes came in, her microphone apparently somewhere near a kettle. "I have half a pie and 3 grandsons on my porch. You come stomp over this ridge in your brave boots, and you explain to them why their dragon neighbors don't get the same mercy you'd offer a busted snowcat. We'll film you with our telephones. They are old, but they work." Snow shifted above as indecision tried to dig in. The mother touched Harlan's shoulder with the horn-rough back of her jaw, a pressure that meant both thank you and do not die appliance. He set his palm against her again, as if the exchange were a pact, and turned back to the cradles because triage sets its own calendar. 3 more were live, hearts fluttering in their tanks like fish learning walls. 2 were dark, shipkeeping the dead with the infinite good manners of machines built to outlive their makers. He made the world smaller, this valve, this strut, this leak, to keep it from becoming the kind of sphere that crushes you. He shouted measurements up the tunnel. A juvenile's narrow head snaked in and held a flashlight in its teeth with what could only be called gallantry. The hatchling under his porch, who had until now contributed chaos and theft, wedged itself at his hip and purred at the pumps until they stayed awake. The first Imperial climbed into view in a suit so clean it apologized for snow. She took in the basin, the open ship, the human knee-deep in warmth. The dragon curled around the entrance like a gate that had decided to love what it sheltered. And her face did a small, honest thing. It dropped the expression she had been issued and reached blindly for one she hadn't used since she'd run a fever and someone had sung at her. "Sir," she said to Harlan, not because she saw him as a superior, but because there wasn't a better word in her training for a human doing the thing under the thing. This site might be safer with a perimeter." "Then make one," Harlan said, because grace is the luxury of those too busy for anger. "Point your guns outward. Keep your nets in your pockets. If anything comes for these kids that doesn't love them, you can be brave at it." She looked at the mother's eye, which looked back, not forgiving, but busy with a better job. She keyed her shoulder. "Picket 7, this is ground 2. Advise we have non-hostile biologicals in sanctuary, an ongoing humanitarian, a repair." She swallowed the word rescue like a stone and let it sit where it would do her spine some good. "Request standoff. We'll document." The mountain listened. The carrier sighed and drifted sideways to watch from less poisonous angles. Drones parked themselves in a respectful square like servants in a house that has decided to stop being cruel. Harlan bent another strut straight and let the newly named pupil at his hip hum triumph into his knee. When the last live cradle settled level and the pumps found a rhythm worth keeping, Harlan stood and realized his whole body had filed a grievance. He laughed at it. The mother made a sound like a door closing softly in a house where everyone is finally asleep. He climbed out the way he'd come in, palms skinned, jacket sacrificed, hair full of flakes that looked like stars and were not. At the lip of the basin, the herd gathered. The injured male leaned against the repaired wing as if testing a new idea of balance. The juveniles pretended not to watch Harlan with hungry eyes. The hatchling clambered onto his boot and sat like a monarch. He looked at the line of Imperial helmets along the trees and the arc of porch lights along the ridge and the dragon's silver bodies, and for the first time since sunset the scale of the thing found him. "You knocked." he said, stupid with relief. The mother lowered her head. He set his hand against her brow as if all conversations began this way. She exhaled, not hot this time, but warm in the way ovens are after bread. The sound that followed wasn't a roar. It was the thing roars try to be when they grow up. A long, layered cord that reached out over the ridge and down the valley and into rooms where people had not yet believed in dragons, and now would, because belief has an easier job when it is attached to a story with an address. It was not triumph, not warning. It was invitation. Harlan felt it move through him and into the generator and along the wire and into the bolt chimes, which took their small place in a large music ringing true. Tomorrow would ask for tools and law and patience and food and a new vocabulary. Tonight had taken his porch and his ridge and found them equal to the work. Come on, he told the hatchling. We've got to teach the pumps the difference between stubborn and faithful. It hopped down, fell over its own feet, and recovered with the immediate dignity of the young. Behind the helmets, the officer who had been brave enough to climb into the basin took her hand off her rifle and, very quietly, took off her helmet. The snow landed on her hair. She let it. The mountain exhaled. The ridge hummed. The herd, having asked and answered, folded themselves around the absurd cabin like a story settling into the shape it was meant to have all along. By dawn, the basin had grown quiet in that suspicious way machines get quiet when they're concentrating. The broodship's pumps kept their new rhythm, like old men keeping each other honest. Steam threaded up through the culvert hole and frosted the edges where cold still held some authority. The imperial officer who had taken off her helmet returned with a scarf and a thermos and the expression of someone who has decided to add disobedience to her toolkit. Agnes arrived on a sled with a battered kettle, 2 blankets, and a broom she wielded like a staff. The ridge watched with all its porches. Harlan spent the morning doing what he did best, small repairs with ludicrous consequences. He shimmed a cracked cradle foot with a biscuit tin lid. He reamed a corroded valve seat with a drill bit. He should have retired and didn't because it wanted one more dance. He tuned the generator down to a purr the dogs could nap to. The juveniles learned how to hold flashlights like gentlemen. The hatchling learned how not to steal them and only failed half the time. The mother stood with her jaw against the rim of the culvert as if holding the hill together with one bone. The first warning arrived as a scent. Hot sugar over iron, a sweetness that had nothing to do with comfort. Harlan smelled it, and every nerve he owned looked up from its newspaper. He pushed past a juvenile, slid down the throat, and landed elbow deep in a sound he didn't like. The pumps were working too hard without admitting it. The hull was warming at the seams. Along the spine, an amber diode pulsed in a sequence you only ever see in training manuals. You promise yourself will stay hypothetical. Someone had pinged the scuttle code. Old warships, especially brood carriers, keep one last sin in their cellar. A controlled burn meant to deny enemies anything resembling a future. The idea was never meant to meet mountain villages and women with brooms. It was meant to meet deserts and guilt. Harlan slapped his palm to the status plate and watched the ancient display drag itself into confession. The scuttle cascade wasn't fully armed, but the ignition lattice had woken and was warming the coolant. Snowmelt pooled in the bilge and steamed. He could hear the low gyre of a percussion sequence spooling up, a mechanical prayer to irreversible acts. There were 7 minutes in the math if nothing else changed. There are always fewer minutes than the math promises. He teed the transceiver. "We've got a fail-safe arming," he said, "no time to be poetic. It will cook the hill, drop the basin, and boil anyone who still thinks they're brave." Agnes did not swear. She sniffed. "Whoever sent that will learn to write letters of apology until their wrist gives out." The officer's voice cut in, careful and fast. "We can blanket with suppression foam." "You'll smother the pumps," Harlan shot back, "and when they die, the heat goes everywhere at once." "What do you need?" He looked at the lattice climbing the wall, a honeycomb of old intelligent plastic waking like a bad memory, and wanted a miracle shaped like a wrench. "Barring that, I need the mountain's resonance, the note we used last night. I need your drones still and listening. I need every porch light on, the generator in full song, and a hole in the hillside there, and there. He pointed even though the hill didn't read hands. "We'll vent the heat the way you vent a pipe, quietly." The mother was already moving. One forefoot sketched a curve into the snow. The injured male planted, grunted, and began to drag his mended wing through the drift in a patient arc. The juveniles took opposite sides, scooping, piling, shaping with the unshowy precision that comes from remembering how to survive in weather. The hatchling attached itself to Harlan's thigh and buzzed at a pitch that made the display on the status plate ripple. "That's the one," he said. "Ridiculous and right. Keep it." He dropped to his knees by the ignition manifold and pulled the panel. A smell like caramelized circuits hit him full in the face. The distributor wheel inside ticked toward inevitability. Thin metal fingers poised to make a circuit that would declare the word "too late" in 4 languages. He slipped the spanner under the housing and lifted. Too much force and the wheel would skip. Not enough, and it would laugh. "Don't be noble," he told the part. "Be lazy." Above, the generator's hum climbed a story. The copper cable lifted the chimes into a tight, bright lattice. Agnes's lights flickered to a rhythm that made the ridge look like it knew choreography. The officer keyed her drones into hover, and then he could hear the decision in her breath, slaved their microphones to the ridge hum, and told their gyros to trust the mountain. The carrier angled away, the better to pretend later that it had not almost done a stupid thing. The herd began to sing. It wasn't the long, layered chord from the night before. It was lower, narrower, a work tone. They tucked their voices into the range where metal can be persuaded and ice loses interest in being stubborn. The mother kept the center and shaped the overtones with a control that would have impressed any engineer. The repaired male, dangerous because he thought he was fine, held the bottom intrepidly. The juveniles filled the middle with a willingness that rode on the edge of pride and did not spill. The hatchling's thin, buzzing line reached into the underlay like a filament. Harlan set his shoulder against the wheel housing and eased. The fingers inside twitched, reconsidered, and failed to make contact by the width of a thumbnail. He laughed, a single startled bark, then turned it into a hum so he didn't lose the pressure. The pumps heard the note the herd kept and stopped trying to pretend they were alone. Their cadence locked to the ridge and then relaxed a fraction, enough to let water turn to steam where it should and heat travel where it could be chaperoned. The Imperial officer scrambled down beside him without asking permission, sleeves rolled, hair already ruined by steam, and took the other side of the housing without flinching. "Point," she said. "Your palm here. Now don't be heroic." "I was top of my class in cowardice," she said between her teeth, and exacted the precise pressure a top coward applies to the world to prevent unnecessary bravery. Steam punched through the vents the dragons had carved and threw white ghosts against the trees. The snow around the holes sagged and then set like glass. Harlan risked a glance at the manifold. The wheel still ticked, but each click landed on a little patch of out-of-tune the song and the hum had made. He saw the next finger coming and knew that if it landed true, the cascade would jump. He would not be able to lie it down again with 2 hands and courage. "Agnes," he said, "on my count, kick the generator a hair. Not a lot. 1 hair. You are asking a grandmother to juggle lightning. You've been doing that since you raised boys. There is a kind of count you speak out loud. There is a kind you do with your lungs." Harlan did both. 3, he said, and the herd deepened in the note. 2, and the officer gritted her teeth. 1, and Agnes breathed the smallest mercy into the governor. The chimes hopped from true to just sharp enough. The ridge joined them. The broodship's ribs took the new pitch with put-upon dignity and bent a hair. The ignition finger landed where the note had been and found itself obliged to be polite. It did not make the circuit. The wheel paused, embarrassed, and sulked. The mother stopped singing. Everyone stopped. Silence hit like a pane of glass, and when it didn't break, the hill remembered how not to hold its breath. Heat glided up and out, less hurried now, like worry turned into work. The amber diode's frantic wink slowed to a steady, reasonable pulse. Steam thinned. The pumps, bless their stubborn hearts, eased into the cadence of machines that have been seen and decided to live a while longer. Harlan took his hands away and did not fall into the water, only because the officer's grip had already compensated for his stupidity. She sat back on her heels and laughed, not because anything was funny, but because the engine of her body wanted to burn some fuel quickly and safely before it offered gratitude, which is a slower combustion. He laughed with her, because it was either that or scare the hatchling with tears. "Who sent the ping?" he asked, when words had remembered how to go through throats. She grimaced. "Automated. The carrier put an old code out, the mountain bounced it wrong, and the ship read it as permission. Then command told me to neutralize your hazard. I have not replied to command." "Keep not replying," Agnes said, sounding like a kettle refusing to boil. They backed out of the throat into air that had learned manners. The herd had finished the vents and sculpted the rims to guide melt into the creek that would carry it to the river, that would carry it to the sea, that had opinions about salts and heat it could keep or give back without telling anyone a story they didn't need to hear. The repaired male looked smug, and then carefully failed to look smug, which is one way to grow up. The hatchling leapt at Harlan's knee and missed entirely, then pretended the snow was more interesting. The mother sank until her head and his chest were level. Close up, he could see the thin ring of pallor around each scale's root, like frost become permanent marker. He reached up, palm against her brow, because ceremony, when it happens enough, becomes fact. She exhaled, and on the breath rode the faintest whisper of scent he hadn't noticed last night, that hidden under heat and work and weather, wild clover flattened by dragon sleep. It undid him the way kindness undoes all men who have arranged themselves around a belief in their own economy. He turned to the officer. "You'll get written up," he said. She shrugged. "I've been written up for less. This one will read better." The carrier lingered high, the better to pretend it had been wise the whole time, then pivoted in the direction of home as briskly as a guest who has borrowed money and decided to remember their manners later. Drones rose and officiated at nothing. On the ridge, the porch lights stayed on. No one told them to go off, and they were enjoying themselves. Harlan leaned against the side of his own mountain and let his bones be buildings. The valley, noticing it had weather and not crisis, decided to enjoy snow again. The brood ship, belly mended with coat and bandage and sarcasm, slept without arming its ghosts. The herd gathered into a crescent that made a room and let him be furniture. The mountain had two hearts now. It had learned to keep both. In the weeks that followed, the basin found a shape that fit what it had been asked to hold. The culvert widened into a mouth lined with basalt cut so cleanly even the river approved. The brood ship's cradles learned to demand only when needed. Their pumps flirted with the ridge hum and then settled into a long partnership. The Imperial reports, penned by an officer who had decided to be precise instead of obedient, used a new category with a shy pride: community-coordinated sanctuary. It would become policy months later, wearing a handful of senators' names like medals. People would credit it to meetings. The ridge knew where it had been born. Harlan's cabin changed its mind about being a hermitage. He wired in an extra panel the size of a table and pretended it had always been there. The bolt chimes gained 3 new notes, currency tokens the juveniles had found in an old trail register and contributed like princes returning with tribute. He built a sliding gate on the porch rail to accommodate the hatchling's opinion that thresholds are suggestions. On the tool wall, the spanner he had used to humiliate the scuttle lattice gained a loop of fabric torn from his sacrificed coat and a small chalk mark. The date the mountain refused an old order. Neighbors came up the ridge with casseroles and questions. Agnes set the kettle on a heat plate and conducted triage with a broom and a presence that refused to be mysterious. Children, human imperial, the one Altesian family that had stayed after the first winter and would stay until their accent grew local, sat on the step and learned what kind of sound a dragon makes when you scratch just behind the jaw hinge where the scale edges soften. The hatchling, that monarchy on 4 feet, became a ridge creature, snifter of lunch pails, stealer of socks, nibbler of bolt heads when bored, a small tyrant you forgave because its sleep was cute. The mother, Harlan found he could say her name without flinching now, because the valley had learned it the way forests learn their hills. Sarai walked the boundary at night and kept the wolves from inventing bad habits. The repaired male, Larch, because Agnes said his ribs looked like trees. Stretched the wing Harlan had braced and found that the mountain's wind had remembered his name. The juveniles became technicians by accident, their curiosity disciplined by a ship that tolerated no bad maintenance and rewarded good with the small satisfactions that make machines addictive. The smooth restart, the clean seal, the pump that decides to outlive a man. The officer, her name was Tamsin, and she refused to be addressed by her rank on the ridge, went back to her carrier with a voice that shook in the right place when she wrote dispatches and did not shake when prosecutors with neat hair asked her why she had deviated. She brought tools and seals and the 3 good coils the quartermaster didn't know were missing. She returned on her days off with a crate of bolts and questions about how to make a drone less stupid. Harlan taught her to listen with her hands. She taught him the exact weight of a legal phrase when you put it in the right ear. Between them, they built a new thing that looked suspiciously like trust. There were crises. They just looked different now. An avalanche started 2 ridges over. Sarai's song and the ridge hum turned its edge into powder and its teeth into foam. A magnet storm came through high and unannounced. The juveniles lay over the broodship's spine and bled off the charge into their own bones, the way their ancestors had learned on marches far uglier than this hill. A courier from a salvage consortium arrived with a smile, papers, and an unfortunate habit of referring to dragons as assets. He left without boots or dignity, and a note pinned to his coat that said the ridge is not for sale in 3 languages, none of which were his. The porch became a bench in the old style, a place where people did not sit to think, but to tinker. Harlan built a console the ship could understand that used piano keys because black and white were easier for clumsy foreclaws than toggles. Sarai learned to set pump schedules with the pad of a talon and the patience of a queen learning a weather instrument. The juveniles learned to change filters and argued about it with the same venom adolescents reserve for questions like who emptied the kettle last. On a day shaped like a promise, the air so clear you could read your choices in it, Larch stood on the ridge and looked at the valley with a professional's calculation. Harlan watched the way he tested his joints, the way he took weight, the way his shadow reached before him like something impatient. "You don't have to make the big one first," Harlan said, "because men who know tools also know when to offer smaller versions of courage." Larch turned his head and gave him a look that was all dragon, amusement at scale as a human phenomenon. He spread his wings, flexed against old memory, settled, flexed again. Sarai stood below, not watching, not cheering, simply being earth so that if he fell, he would fall toward something. Harlan stood beside her and pressed his palm to her brow because he had learned it steadied him as much as it honored her. Larch ran 5 steps and lipped. The wind, decent and sober, took him by the chest and did the first arithmetic. His right wing, the mended one, trembled and then went smooth, remembering air like a song whose verse you forgot and then suddenly didn't. He banked once, messy as bread dough, then twice, clean as a new-cut plank. He rose until his silver ribs learned a darker color and then came down, confident, laughing the way bodies laugh when they finally drop decades of weather. The ridge almost clapped. Agnes actually did, broom held aloft. Tamsin whooped into her scarf and then pretended the noise had been the wind. The juveniles bowed to physics with exaggerated sarcasm. The hatchling took it as permission to climb on Harlan's back. He carried it 2 steps and then pretended to fall over so it could feel large. Sarai's exhale lifted the corner of the cabin's roof and settled it without apology. After the flight, Larch stood in front of the porch and bowed his long neck and let Harlan lay his hand against the plate above his heart. The scale there was warmer than elsewhere. Harlan could feel the thud behind it, an approving metronome. "You're good," he said, and it wasn't praise. It was a measurement. In the evening, when the work ran out and the tea ran down and the ridge decided to be a neighborhood again, the mountain gathered its sounds into a single kindness. Porch lights came up. Pipes knocked once in the distance, a polite cough. The broodship's core purred like a resolved argument. The generator, a reformed cynic, sighed into idle. Harlan sat on the step, with Sarai's shadow falling over his boots. the hatchling's ridiculous head in his lap, and Tamsin curled in a borrowed sweater that had been a sail in a younger story. "What are you now?" she asked him finally, after the kind of quiet that considers itself a privilege. "Still a mechanic," he said, surprised by the steadiness with which the answer arrived. "Just more kinds." Sarai made a sound like agreement written in heat. Agnes, who had brought a pie and taken a pie pan and would never admit to balance sheets, tapped Harlan's shoulder with the broom. "You'll need a sign," she said. "For the road?" "For the door. People like knowing they've arrived where they meant to. Put Ridgekeeper on it, and open." He looked at the door he had built for solitude and saw how much room it had been keeping for something else. He nodded. "I'll carve it tomorrow." "Tonight," Sarai said. The word felt more than heard. Harlan laughed because orders are sweeter when they come from those who keep you breathing. He took the old wood burner from its nail, the one he used to mark sizes on tool handles and dates on projects that tried to forget their birthdays, and, by porch light and dragon heat, he wrote the word in careful strokes. When he finished, he held the plank up. The letters glowed a little, the way new names do. The herd looked. The officer smiled like a future she hadn't known she wanted had found her while she'd been doing something brave and ordinary. The ridge approved with a murmur of pipes and a blink of lights and the shiver of bolt chimes in a wind that had come to be an ally. Down in the basin, the pumps turned over like old men satisfied with how the day had been managed. Inside the broodship, tiny hearts practiced the art of not being afraid. On the porch, beneath a roof that had learned the weight of dragons, a man who had built his life to be ignored found that being seen was a better kind of quiet. When the wind shifted, the mountain carried the new sign's warm wood smell out over the valley like a declaration shy of a law. In 100 kitchens, supper tasted better. In a dozen bunks, sleep arrived without bargaining. In the carrier's mess, a pilot who had once raised her rifle and then lowered it wrote to her mother and didn't lie. And in the roots of the ridge, a broodship dreamed less of deserts and more of porches. Harlan set the plank beside the door to cool. The hatchling yawned so wide the stars might have fallen in and snapped it shut quick so he could own them still. Sarai tipped her head. He put his palm against her brow, ceremony now a habit, and the mountain, listening, learned the gesture. Tomorrow there would be forms. Tomorrow there would be arguments about boundaries and fuel and whose creek this was when it wanted to be a river. Tonight there was bread and heat and the strange, enormous calm that arrives when a place and its people have finally agreed on each other.